On today's World Insight with Tian Wei, a realistic look at the Chinese economy, challenges and potentials. The Central Economic Work Conference sets the tone.
I love the concept of Wu Wei. Can you say it in a proper Chinese accent?
Wu Wei.
Wu Wei.
And the pursuit of harmony between life and work. From one of the hardest working professional women, media magnate Arianna Huffington. Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei. The program is coming to you live on CGTN from Beijing. First up, a meeting which charts the course of China's economic policy going into the year 2019 has wrapped up in Beijing. The annual Central Economic Work Conference from China has laid out the policy priorities for the year ahead. These include the full pursuit of high-quality manufacturing to finely tuned fiscal policy. Before our discussion about this, take a look.
A roadmap for China's future economic development. Taking a consistent stance on major policies, Chinese senior officials charted the course for the nation's economy. In 2019, China will continue to pursue a proactive fiscal policy and prudent monetary policy. It also emphasizes that monetary policy should strike an appropriate balance between tightening and loosening to ensure reasonably ample liquidity, while proactive fiscal policy should be stronger and more efficient. The measures are part of government's efforts to foster high-quality development while stabilizing the financial sector. Experts say the nation's economy may face greater downward pressure in the new year, but add there's no need to be pessimistic.
We won't be facing some radical changes on the policy or on the internal environment. I think that's a good news. Despite all these difficulties, I think the government still have a lot of cards in hands. For instance, we can still have some more room to lower a required rate of reserve, lower our interest rate.
7 tasks will be prioritized for next year's economic development, including pushing for high-quality development of manufacturing sector, forming a stronger domestic market, speeding up reform of economic structure, and promoting comprehensive opening up. The meeting also called for a larger scale of tax cuts and reducing administrative fees.
Tax cuts will not only improve profitability of these private companies, be able to increase the funding and the financing ability for these businesses, but also promote or boost the efficiency of the government.
The meeting also pointed out that China is still in an important period of strategic opportunity, adding the country needs to take chances and speed up transformation of economic structure, improve capabilities of scientific innovation, and deepen the nation's opening up and reform.
For more discussion on China's future economic policy as a result of the Central Economic Work Conference, meet our panelists. Here in Beijing, Xu Sitao, Chief Economist of Deloitte China. In Hong Kong, we invited Hong Hao, the Managing Director and Head of Research from Bocom International. In Washington, D.C., Han Chuan, who is a former senior official of the Institute of International Finance and the IMF. Welcome to the three of you, gentlemen. I want to start with you, Mr. Xu. The shining point, as you see it, from the outcome of this year's annual economic conference, briefly.
Yeah, a few things. First of all, I think the conference has recognized there is a pressure on economic growth. Economic deceleration, I think, continues. Precisely because of that, the conference has pledged to use counter-cyclical measures. In other words, just more decisive fiscal tools and potentially monetary easing, and to cushion economic downturn potentially, and of course, external shock. And more importantly, I think the conference has also emphasized the importance of implementation of the trade, the trade talk between China and the United States.
Mr. Hong, go to you now about your takeaway from the Central Economic Work Conference.
Yeah, I think the meeting really re-emphasized the challenges ahead, and also emphasized that China has necessary policy tools to deal with the uncertainties. And also, I think the meeting review what had happened during 2018. It has been a challenging year, to say the very least. But I think going forward, China is ready to use policy instruments to support and stabilize growth.
Mr. Tran, of course, the international media has been jumping onto the story and about the detailed analysis of everything coming out of the World Conference. Your takeaway?
Well, I think the World Conference has given appropriate guidance for economic priorities for the next year, meaning promoting domestic consumption, which is already happening with domestic consumption this year, providing for more than 5 percentage points of growth, and that will be a key part of growth going forward. And secondly, promoting the services sector, which is already happening, with services growing by almost 8% year-over-year so far this year, while manufacturing and production less than 6%. So overall, appropriate priorities going forward.
Gentlemen, I want to analyze several points inside this statement coming out of the World Conference with you. First of all, about pressure turned into impetus. Secondly, about China's reform and how to deal with some of the biggest challenges, including the reform of the state-owned enterprises, and also about further reform and opening up, as well as how to prevent further challenges in the fiscal sector. Let's do it one by one. So, Mr. Xu, we noticed more than one time in the statement that there's talking about turning pressure into impetus. That's being said in so many different ways. You could find it almost in every paragraph. What does that say to you? What kind of pressure, what kind of impetus is most important?
Well, pressures are really coming from two fronts. External pressure is really about trade tensions. That's why to implement what was being agreed between China and the United States for the next, whether 80 days or 90 days, that's very important. So
according
that's really
to the statement, if I could just read a little bit, the exact line, it said to implement the consensus built at the China-U.S. Heads of State meeting on the sideline of the G20 in Argentina, and push forward the discussion, negotiation of trade between China and the U.S. That's exactly the phrase being used here, Mr. Xu.
Yeah, so if I decipher, that statement, that really means greater market access. Now, the domestic pressure is really about deleveraging. The government has been trying very hard to reduce leverage for large state-owned enterprises and local government, but of course, it's challenging. So the emphasis from this report is on removing zombie companies. In fact, the report explicitly mentioned that market clearing price.
All right. Mr. Hong, of course, this topic has been discussed among many of us many times. This time, does it really mean that efforts going to be made in massive scale in order to achieve the goal?
I would say so, but I think it's a continuing theme throughout many conferences already. I think China has been trying hard to reform the SOEs, and I think in the last 3 years we're actually seeing the importance of SOE firms increasing in the Chinese economy, in the sense that these firms are getting more bank lending support, and also the percentage of contribution of these firms to the Chinese GDP is actually growing. So I think it's a sort of a byproduct of our successful supply side reform, because when you do this kind of reform, the upstream resource companies, that tend to be resource heavy and capital heavy, they're getting more support from the government.
But to you, what exactly is the kind of pressure? What exactly is the kind of impetus that can be built out of the pressure, Mr. Hong?
Yeah, I would say that the Chinese observers always have this saying that one needs a a good crisis to engineer a good reform, because that is the time, when you're forced to a corner, you have to make some changes, right? So it's kind of a philosophical way to look at it. I think impetus really coming from outside as well. I think Stateowned just now mentioned, some internal pressure, but also externally, we have a trade negotiation going on with the U.S. Because of that, we have seen China actually accelerated its reform and open process. For example, in the financial sector, now that the foreign investors can own a majority of stake in many of the financial industries.
Right. Mr. Tran, of course, what's being said out of the statement from the Central Economic Work Conference needs to be read in correlates with many of the other important statements coming from China recent days. For example, 40 years anniversary reform and opening up meeting, Chinese President Xi Jinping also said that China would learn from everyone. However, there's not so-called absolute teacher that China has to follow everything coming from the advice coming from that specific party. That's very interesting when you read what is going on right now. So how should we comprehensively understand where China is heading for in terms of pressure, in terms of impetus, and in terms of its potential policies? Mr. Tran, your understanding from Washington.
Yes, basically, since opening up 40 years ago, China has followed an export-driven growth strategy, manufacturing for export, opening up and invite foreign direct investment to build up manufacturing capacity. Going forward, with that potential being reduced, not only through trade tension but through the maturing of the global economy, it is clear that the future in China is, as I said before, lie more in developing domestic market, developing domestic consumption, and here particularly consumption of services. There's room for that to grow, particularly in education, healthcare, and so on and so forth. So I think that is clearly turning the pressure into something which is in China's interest in the long run. And secondly, in terms of quality of growth, I think the more China can roll out things like 5G communication network, artificial intelligence and so on, and also roll out infrastructure project in the rural areas, those things will also help promote growth going forward.
Mr. Xu, briefly?
Yes, I agree with what Mr. Tran has said. I think it's important to use fiscal levers to provide better safety net so that the economy can withstand all these challenges.
Mr. Xu, I also want to ask you further about the state-owned enterprise reform. Earlier you touched on that topic, but shall we go a little bit more in detail? According to the statement coming out of the Central Economic Work Conference, there is specific part dealing with how to reform the state-owned enterprises. For example, encouraging and stick to, as you said, the separation between politics and business management, the administration, and also the capital, as well as push forward the principle of fair competition. Meanwhile, the rule of law is also being emphasized, the so-called establishing and creating the rule of law system as well as the environment. How should we understand these key phrases?
I think all these key phrases essentially means China would like to improve corporate governance and reducing political interference. In fact, if some of this will be implemented to have some separation between politics and the business operation, and I think state-owned enterprises scope of business will be more narrowly defined. So, for example, in a sense, SOEs should only operate in the area where there's no perfect competition, because by default, state-owned enterprises would always get more preferential treatments in terms of access of capital, so on and so forth.
Well, Mr. Xu, certainly you have your own version of further interpretation of what exactly is the document.
Yeah.
That's your personal interpretation,
Yeah.
by the way. Mr. Hong also mentioned, related to the state-owned enterprises, there's also the capital market to establish transparent, open, and also lively or energetic, as well as the important capital market. How should we understand these adjectives in front of the capital market?
Yeah, that's many adjectives that we add in front of the
Well,
market.
I guess for someone who's been working for the capital market, you know better than we do. What does it mean?
Yeah, well, I think it basically means that people whoever that is operating in the market should let the market force do the determination in terms of pricing and also in terms of how they're getting financing support from the market to support its further growth. Now, I think for now, Sitao just mentioned, these firms may get some preferential treatments, because they're big, resourceful, and full of capital. So, when they want to grow, they can easily borrow money from the bank. Now, the side effect from that really is that, China's growth has been built upon leveraging. So, these firms, as they grow, they borrow more and more money, and because they have stable cash flow, they can actually service those debts, and therefore, the Chinese growth is actually a debt-fueled growth. So I think going forward, in order to let the smaller private firms to have a bigger role in the economy, I think we probably need to support them and give more guided lending support and more capital market support, for those guys to grow up.
But on the other hand, Mr. Tran, of course, one of the issues facing China, as being clearly stated from the outcome statement of the Central Economic Work Conference, is about the, in a way, the challenges facing China's financial market, the ups and downs, and it wants to avoid future crisis as a result of events happening elsewhere in the world. So, and as well as deleveraging, of course, that's always been a major theme for China's economic policy. So, Mr. Tran, how shall we understand now how that will be done, given the recent geopolitics, given the recent apparent trade war, and also given the transformation of the global economy?
Yes, I think that there have been, as I said, progress already made in that direction. First, in terms of deleveraging, if you look at the growth of credit to the non-financial sector in China, it has slowed down from 16% at the beginning of last year, 14% beginning of this year, and now less than 12%. Going forward, probably the pace of reduction may stay, but the rebalancing of the lending also has progressed, and very important, less from non-bank sources and more from official banking lending, which is, I think, a positive statement. Secondly, China has opening up through measures like the Bond Connect, Stock Connect, and opening up, allowing foreign entities to invest in domestic market in China. It is important a measure to improve the efficiency of the Chinese domestic capital markets.
Right.
And to the extent that China going forward will have current account deficit, that will be also important to attract capital flow to finance the deficit.
Right.
Overall, the trade tension is one deterrent to this plan coming to fruition, and therefore it is important that the effort to be made to reduce the trade tension.
I see. Mr. Hong, it is no secret that over the past few weeks and months, China has put out quite a number of new measures in order to open up the market, in order to level the playing field, that particularly in the financial sector. You see one new thing coming out almost every day, or probably more than one. Mr. Hong, how shall we and the market going to digest that? And meanwhile, when problems coming up, usually it comes together with new policies, right? There's no policy that could be perfect. So how to cushion some of the challenges as a result of early implementation of the new policies?
Yeah, I think it's keeping all the new policies are keeping strategists and economists very busy. I think going forward, the reason why we're having all this further reform really, is because of the trade negotiation and also some external pressure from this negotiation. But then having said that, many of the domestic Chinese industries has matured to such a level that it can withstand foreign competition in many ways. For example, the investment banking industry that I'm working in has grown sophisticated over the years, in a sense that, for example, many of the research products that we produce here in China by many of the Chinese investment banks rivals, or maybe sometimes even better, surpass the quality of many of the international firms. So it's not necessarily that just because the international firms have a very strong foothold in the global market, they can come into the Chinese market and start to compete away the profits of Chinese firms. I think because over the years Chinese firms has learned and grown and to such a competitive level that is competitive even if we allow foreign firms to come in.
So you are saying, Mr. Hong, China is ready?
I think so. In many ways. For example, the auto industry is another good example. I think China is able to make electrical cars that is just as good as Tesla, for example, and many of the Chinese electrical cars are making international debut and receive raving reviews from international observers. So I would say that many of the industries are more than ready.
Mr. Xu, China is ready.
Yeah, I fully agree.
What about that, the future competition? And what about the so-called cushioning of the challenges as a result of the early implementation of the brand new policies? Mr. Xu.
Well, I think these implementations are very important because all these critical, incremental changes, I think will make the negotiation go more smoothly.
Before we go, I do want to invite your wisdom, gentlemen, about some of the key words, because reform has been, and opening up has been repeatedly mentioned in the statement. Well, at the same time, stability has also been repeatedly mentioned in the statement. We could find them almost in every paragraph. How should we see the combination of these phrases? How should we reconcile, it seems, the different directions that these words are pointing to? Mr. Hong first.
Yeah, I would say that reform and open is really better to, it's a better way to stabilize the economy. The economy has grown to such a gigantic size and also has incorporated so many foreign forces into our domestic economy. So, unless you reform and open further, and invite foreign competition and to actually and help the Chinese firms to improve their games during competition, then you eventually reach a equilibrium that is more stabilizing than before. So I would say that reform and open is one of the better way to stabilize and grow the Chinese economy.
Got it. Mr. Tran, how do you see that as an observer of China?
Basically, those three elements, reform, opening up, and maintain and stabilize growth, always form the three essential part of policy approach in China. The key point is that the emphasis will change from time to time. So I think in the next year, 2019, while all three will be pursued, the emphasis probably will be more on stabilizing growth through appropriate fiscal and monetary policy, and particularly through supporting household sector and small and medium-sized enterprises.
Got it. And Mr. Xu, last but not least, very briefly, sir.
So for me, I think the shift from job creation to de-emphasizing economic growth rate, that's very important. If indeed the growth model moving to service area, then you don't need such high growth rate. So I think the policymakers have decided to tolerate the slower growth rate in order to have better quality of growth.
Xu Sitao, Hong Hao, Han Feng. Really appreciate, gentlemen, for joining us from Beijing, Hong Kong, and Washington, D.C. Thank you for being with us.